Recording progress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, South Korea's General Elections, Implications for Yoon's Foreign Policy. My name is Rachel Min-Young Lee, and I am a senior fellow with the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. While I recently joined to work on 38 North, focused on North Korea, I am pleased to announce that Stimson has just launched a Korea program led by our director, Jenny Town, which will engage on issues relevant to the whole of the Korean Peninsula, U.S. relations with both Koreas, and approaches to global issues of mutual concern, especially between the U.S. and South Korea. Today's event is the first of our programming under the New Korea program, examining the results of South Korea's April 10 general elections and the implications for President Yoon's foreign policy going forward. Today, we are joined by an excellent panel of speakers. Michelle Ye-hee Lee, Tokyo Bureau Chief at The Washington Post, reporting on Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Previously, Michelle covered money and influence in politics and voting access on the National Political Enterprise and Accountability Team, and was a reporter for the Post's Fact Checker. J. James Kim, lecturer at the Executive Master of Public Policy and Administration program at Columbia University, and former research fellow and director of regional studies and public opinion research at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Seoul. His primary research interests include domestic drivers of foreign policy, political economy, methodology, election, and public opinion. Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. In his current role, Troy oversees KEI's trade and economic related initiatives, as well as the Institute's relations with Capitol Hill and the Washington, D.C. trade community. In the interest of time and to make this event as interactive as possible, we will dive right into the questions. I would like to remind our audience that they are welcome to submit questions into the Zoom Q&A box at any time during the event, and we will address them after our moderated discussion. So let's dive into the questions. What a disappointing result for the ruling party and the Yoon government. The People Power Party came into the election hoping that it would win a majority, but I think that's not really what they are. The outcome has come to be. So let's start with the broad question of what was the most striking aspect of the election outcome? And I will turn to you first, Michelle. What was your biggest takeaway from the election?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to see the Stimson Center have this project, the expanding to the whole Korean Peninsula, and to be a part of this. So first of all, I would say I wasn't entirely surprised by the results because there were, the signs were pointing to a DP likely win, but I wasn't sure exactly how much the margin would be. Although at the end it was getting quite chaotic with the Choguk run that I wasn't exactly sure how it would turn out. Still, I think my biggest takeaway was just how the conservatives have not been able to build a bigger base since the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, and just how deep the voter discontent runs in South Korea, which I think sometimes we could lose sight of because we talk a lot about Yoon's foreign policy and his efforts on foreign policy. The Conservative Party has now lost 3 general elections in a row now, 2016, 2020, 2024. Yoon only won the presidential election by a razor-thin margin. He clearly has not expanded his base since. His approval ratings have really topped out once they hit, I think, the 30s or so. And, this election was a referendum on his first 2 years in office and whether the voters were happy with the way the country and the politics are running under his leadership and his party, and whether they want the Liberals to remain a check on his leadership. And I think the answer was very clear yesterday. And that's been the main analysis here that I've been watching and hearing and reading today in Seoul from both the conservative and liberal sides. I believe, elections overall are usually about what voters feel the most about the economy and healthcare. And I think this election was about that as well, about those fundamental voter concerns. And I think it really showed that those concerns are intensifying. The country's economy is slowing, the fertility rate is the world's lowest, the housing crisis is not abating, income inequality is growing. And I think all of that was summed up quite nicely in the green onion controversy that preceded the election, when President Yoon went to the markets and really underestimated the price of green onions. And it really struck a fire here. And I think that sort of concern about the day-to-day lives of voters were really underscored during this election, and those fundamental frustrations really blew up. And that's kind of what I see as the biggest takeaway from these results.
Thank you for that, Michelle. James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, for inviting me to this, and congratulations to the Stimson Center and to your program for launching this program, and also to be joining such distinguished colleagues here. It's always a pleasure to talk about the Korean election, and I think Michelle pretty much touched on almost everything. It was what was interesting. Two things for me was how closely the presidential approval rating and the support for the Conservative Party comported with the actual result. With about a third of the General Assembly going towards the Conservatives, that's about where the president's approval rating was, along with that of the party, even though the party was hovering between high 30s at one point. So maybe the results were written on the wall already, so to speak. The second thing for me was that the Conservatives failed to reframe the issue away from a judgment or referendum on President Yoon to some of these other issues that could be more, favorable for the Conservatives, policy-related issues that the leadership in the Conservative Party had sort of flirted with during the election. So they talked about, for instance, cutting back or eliminating the capital gains tax. They also talked about moving the National Assembly from Yeouido down to Sejong City. This previously was a progressive agenda, but now the Conservatives are announcing that they're embracing it. So this could potentially be, a breakthrough if the Conservatives are able to win enough seats to actually legislate some of these changes. But it didn't happen. And the result why it didn't happen was because the progressives were campaigning on, this issue about the economy and the poor performance of the Yoon administration. And that seemed to have, and the Conservatives just never got around to reframing that issue, to take the voter attention away from that issue to some other issues that's more future-oriented and more favorable for the Conservatives.
Thank you for that, James. And Troy?
Well, Rachel, thanks again for having me here. It's a delight to be here with you, James, and Michelle. And once again, congratulations as well on the new Korea Center. So I think, Michelle and James have both sort of laid this out really well. So I'll just try to add a couple little additional points. One, when we look at since 2016, it's not just the National Assembly elections that the Conservatives have lost. You have Moon Jae-in's presidential victory within that period. So actually, if you go back, you have now 5 elections to where, in essence, the Democratic Party has won, or in the case of Yoon's presidential election, almost won. That was decided by about 1/10 of a point. So in essence, you could have had now almost a decade of unmitigated, rule by the progressive side in Korea. So I think that's a big takeaway for me, is that there seems to be a much broader shift on the politics side to where the Democratic Party is doing very well, and conservatives have struggled for almost a decade now, and it predates actually Park Geun-hye coming to power. So you're seeing sort of a shift there. The other is, when we look at even the early results last night, where it looked like the DP might do better, but some of the polling lead up suggested that the People Power Party, Yoon's party, would actually maybe gain a few seats. And instead, we saw the opposite. They ended up losing a few seats, and the DP gained a few. And so marginal swings. But what is interesting to me is that if you look more broadly at elections, especially when a party has a large majority like the DP had coming into this election, usually you see a little bit of that majority get whittled away. Sometimes you have an extremely talented politician like Tony Blair in the UK who's able to grow a large majority, but that's not usually the case. And so I think what that says to me is this is sort of what, Michelle was getting at before. There is a lot of discontent in South Korea right now with the way things are going. And we're sort of seeing that in the inability of the president's party to take and actually even gain marginal or see marginal gains in the National Assembly.
Thank you, Troy. Troy, you mentioned that the PPP lost a few seats. Did they not gain a few more seats? James, can you
I think Troy's
can you
referring to
clarify
the
that?
coalition that the
Yeah.
conservatives had coming into this
okay.
election.
Sorry about
And
that.
it included, yes, they did gain more seats, but the conservative
PPP,
coalition
yes.
was a bit broader. So to
Mhm.
some extent, Troy,
Right.
maybe Troy's, I think, correct in saying that the conservatives kind of lost a bit of the presence that they had in the National Assembly than they used to. Now, if you're talking about the PPP, you're definitely correct. So you're both right on this.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. All right. So James, I want to turn to you now. You recently wrote a piece for the Korea program, providing your analysis of past election patterns and what lessons we might derive from them. How does the latest election compare to general elections in recent history? And how did the outcome align with your own projections?
So I think in that paper, I had several scenarios laid out because, you can never be right with these elections. So the best way to hedge is to have different scenarios, different possible scenarios with some probabilistic outcomes. And I think what I saw as the most likely outcome was, the PPP, which is the position point that you made earlier, would gain a few seats, but the legislative dynamics wouldn't necessarily change much because, the party approval wasn't that high. But traditionally, ruling parties tended to perform better in these elections. That is, they often gained seats. In terms of the coalition, that's more a strategic dynamic between parties. So I'm not sure exactly how it would have worked out. For instance, if the new Reform Party was able to make some compromises on its position and work with the conservatives on some party platform related issues. But that never happened, obviously, because Lee Jun-suk was kicked out of the party leadership by, the pro-president, pro-Yoon faction. So he wasn't going to make any deals with them. So there was something about the internal party dynamic, inter-party dynamic that prevented a sort of a broader conservative coalition from forming. And PPP wanted to go about this in their own way. And so that, I expected the PPP, okay, so let's say PPP compared to where they were 4 years ago, they were going to gain seats. They did gain seats, but it wasn't a lot. It was about 5 seats. Let me just show you real quick. I just want to do this very quickly. Well, we talked about the turnout. So here's they gained about 5 seats, and the Democrats lost about 5 seats. If you look at the regions where the PPP performed well, they gained seats in Seoul and Cheongangwon, but it wasn't to the extent that they wanted because they were starting from such a low bar. They actually lost some seats in Gyeonggi, and they lost a seat in Ulsan as well. This was, as I said, somewhat written in the wall, given that the president, the approval for the ruling party wasn't that high. And this is a direct contrast to 4 years ago when, most of the voters thought that, you should support the ruling party. And that's how the results came out. And, it's just really interesting also in terms of the types of issues. This is keywords from the stump speeches. And what you're seeing, the numbers are the number of times that these words were mentioned by each leader of the respective party. And as you can see, it seems as though Lee Jae-myung was focusing on this issue of judgment and authority of the president to push through his policies and how bad the economy was. Meanwhile, the leadership and the Conservative Party just couldn't get around to these sort of issues like the economy, or some other policy-related issues. Instead, they focused on the personalities, and they focused on sort of mudslinging. And so it became a sort of like a, I think someone said earlier during break time, or as we were preparing, that this became a food fight. And that's exactly what this became. Meanwhile, the voters are more interested and in the economy and the president's, how should I say, style of managing national agenda. And so it seems as though it was already written on the wall, so to speak, that the results were going to be what they were going to be, because the conservatives and the president wasn't able to move the issue in their favor. And the progressives were able to define the boundaries of what this election was going to be, and that's how the voters voted. That is somewhat surprising, that they weren't able to do that, even though most ruling parties have that advantage, and the president has the bully pulpit. So they weren't able to capitalize, and the question here is why.
So, as I say, James, if you don't mind, I was looking at, the word cloud you basically put up, and, I noticed that on the conservative side, Cho-Kook and Lee Jae-myung were sort of the two lead things. But if you look at it, there's not really a policy. And so in some ways, it seems to me like they made a conscious choice to go after individuals rather than to try and drive an agenda. I mean, do you think that that was the case?
Definitely on the side of the conservatives, that's how it turned out in the last 2 weeks. For the progressives, there was that whole incident with the scallions, and how the prices had gone up so much. And the president wasn't in touch with the realities on the ground. Again, so that was an economic issue that touched on sort of voter concern, which was the number 1 issue for them, and why they weren't supporting the president. And the conservatives didn't have an answer for that. And the second thing was about president's style of management, and that sort of seemed to have worked against him as well. So, and that's another issue that the progressives sort of played on throughout the election.
Michelle, did you have anything to add? In your opinion, what were the main causes of the ruling party's defeat?
Yeah, I mean, James just had such a great overview of that. And I think he really got at really a fundamental party dynamics there. I think the couple things that I would add, one is that, there's really the important swing voters of this election, of course, other than like the few independents, but were the people in their 20s and 30s, the people who were really feeling the growing income inequality very acutely. And they're concerned that they're going to be the first generation in Korean history to be worse off than their parents. And there's not been meaningful change policy-wise for this generation since the presidential election, when they were also the swing voters for the same reason, and nothing that quite gives them any more confidence in the ruling party that they would do better if they were in leadership in the National Assembly. And I do want to expand on what James was alluding to, which was President Yoon's leadership style, because this it is a very divisive point in Korea. And I was actually stunned at the 3 conservative media outlets' editorial boards today. They all 3 came out very strongly criticizing the president for his leadership style. They talked about how, he has been fundamentally a prosecutor as a president. He's not someone who's been playing politics the way that politicians typically do. He's shown no interest in governing through compromise. He rarely does media interviews, doesn't do press conferences, and he's never sat down with Lee Jae-myung as party leader. And we can debate about whether that's even effective in such a polarized society like Korea, and really even the US too. But I do think a lot of it does come down to this buck stops here approach that the president really emphasizes. And there were other self-inflicted issues that came up just prior to the election, like the appointment of the embattled defense minister to as ambassador to Australia, and then watching all these reporters chase after him in Sydney and then eventually have to pull him back to Seoul. And then there was a Dior bag scandal, and then President Yoon digging his heels in it. I do think all of this, the politics of it, and then the personality of the president really backfired on the party this time. And I do think that the ruling party's decision to invest in Han Dong-un as their election strategy, as the guy who was going to resolve it all for the party, his personality-driven politicking. I saw the PPP's election video that came out last week. It was 3 minutes of just photos and videos of Han Dong-un. That was it, to music. It was just videos after videos, photos of him charming and being really with the crowd. And they unleashed him to really charm the public. And it's clear the tactic did not work because there are really deep-seated fundamental underlying mistrust that the public has toward the party and toward President Yoon and his governing style.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I want to now shift to policy, where the election results leave the Yoon administration's ability to forge ahead with its policy agenda for the remaining 3 years of the administration. Clearly, the results would indicate that he would not be supported, but rather be hampered. But then, with foreign policy, I guess you could ask the question of, well, how might the election outcome even impact Yoon's ability to forge ahead with his foreign policy agenda for the remaining 3 years? So, Troy, I want to turn over to you now. What do you think? Do you think that there will even be any real implications on the policy front for Yoon for the next 3 years?
So, oh, sorry. Yeah. So to say, on one hand, if you look at this election result, while obviously, the Conservative Party hoped to do better, in essence, you end up with a National Assembly that is largely where we were before. And so if we look at the last couple of years under Yoon, where he's had an assembly dominated by the opposition, in essence, about a third of his policy priorities of the legislation they've submitted have passed. Now, that runs, looking at some prior presidents, at about half of their success rates. A lot of them had about 60% of the legislation they put forward get through. So in essence, he's hamstrung. There's been some significant pieces of legislation that have come through on supply chain security that has passed, the setting up of CASA, which is the Korean version of NASA, some tax changes to take and exempt first-time home buyers from some taxes and things. So there have been some policy successes. So it hasn't been as though there's been a complete grind to a halt. But clearly the dynamic at play right now is one that's challenging for the conservatives. And so, we talked about, or Michelle mentioned polarization, and we're in a much more polarized world than we were. And this is something that's trending across democracies. It's not something that's unique to the United States. It's not something that's unique to Korea, though it plays out differently, I think, in each country, in the sense that, Steph Haggard did a piece for us a couple of years ago, and I'm sure some of this has changed since then, looking at detailed voter data. And in essence, what he found is that actually the majority of the Korean population is moderate, but you have very extreme wings, and there's a smaller part of the population, but they're driving policy. So polarization of the population and the politics are two separate things in this context. But in the broader sense, I think right now the Yoon administration, has a choice. And obviously politics is different in different countries, but to me, this feels a lot like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, came into office. He wasn't necessarily very popular. There were scandals early on. He tried to bulldoze things through, and they lost the House for the first time in decades. And so what did Clinton do? He could have tried to continue the same policies going forward. Instead, he realized, all right, I have to pivot. I have to take and try and find a compromise with my opponents. And so I think this is where the Yoon administration is now. They have a choice. They could continue to do the same way they went forward the last few years, and we've seen the results. You can get some major things done to where there's clearly a sense of national agreement within the country on certain key issues, or you can take and say, all right, here's my agenda. how will this agenda match up with my opposition party, and where can we find some compromise? And so I think that's sort of where they are. Which path? Do they take the Clinton path of post 94, or do they continue on and do what, to be honest, a lot of leaders are doing today, which is continue to try appeal to your base, continue with your policies regardless of the political dynamics at play. And just to give one last sort of U.S. example, Mike Johnson, who's now Speaker in the U.S., came in with a very hardline position. He's moderated that because at some point he realized, as Speaker, your job is to take and try and find a way to advance policy that's in the interest of the country. And so I think that's sort of where we are now. Yoon can still advance things, not necessarily lots changed, but he has an opportunity here to actually maybe improve on his legislative record.
Troy, you mentioned something, you mentioned earlier that Yoon has had a number of policy successes, but then, when you look at the outcome of the election, the ruling party lost, right? I think it is fair to say that Yoon, the Yoon administration did, came in very strong about strengthening the US-ROK alliance, strengthening US-ROK Japan security cooperation in the region. But despite that, and I guess foreign policy was not a major agenda item in these elections. But despite some of these foreign policy successes, although those might not be seen as foreign policy successes by some, he still lost. So can we say that foreign policy played any kind of role in the general elections, you think? And James or Michelle, you can also feel free to jump in.
I mean, looking at the data James put up, foreign policy was 3% of the reason why, the populace supports Yoon. In a broad sense, foreign policy tends to not be a major factor. Things like, and Michelle talked about this, education, healthcare, say the economy, jobs, these things drive elections. You can have foreign policy become a more significant part of an election depending on the broader environment. But, Yoon's successes, weren't likely going to drive that. If you had a crisis, that could potentially drive it. And it's sort of like in another dynamic, if you look at this, when Trump was pursuing talks with North Korea, some people talked about that was an election strategy. I mean, even if he had gotten a deal and a deal that was universally praised, it wouldn't have really impacted the election in the United States, and even outside the pandemic. Like, if we hadn't had the pandemic, it was a normal election. Because, ultimately, the thing that drives voters in most countries are those domestic issues. And so I think, that's the challenge Yoon faced. And I think Michelle actually did a really great job of sort of laying out some of the challenges Korea faces early on. And there was an op-ed I was reading recently that kind of talked about how the challenge in a lot of democracies now is that we've become very good at solving a lot of the traditional problems, like eliminating mass poverty, educating the population, everything. But in doing so, we've created, in essence, these types of problems you want to have. How do you create more high-paying jobs? How do you take and make sure the rest of the population gets high education? All the things that are really hard to do. How do you deal? Because healthcare is so good and people live longer in life, you don't need as many children to take and survive just to be able to take it. Because we have social safety nets to take care of people in their old age. But we haven't figured out now how do you address then the challenges that come from that, from dropping or declining demographics and all these other issues. And so in some ways, we're at a point to where there are a lot of issues that are coming up that we don't know how to address yet. And parties are struggling to address these. And I think, this was what Michelle was sort of laying out when you talk about the younger generation and their concerns and, the demographic challenges and these other issues. And so I think, those are the kinds of things that are going to play a lot more in an election than, whether relations are somewhat closer to the United States or, whether we've made more progress on foreign policy issues.
I'll hop in here. I really like the way Troy framed this moment about how like the comparison to the Clinton era, and I agree about how it's going to depend a lot on how President Yoon takes it from here. He said today, he released a very brief statement today saying he's going to accept the will of the people and that he'll try to do some reforms. It wasn't really committal, but I do think that it matters a lot whether how Yoon takes it from this position. One of the things that Yoon has not done is act in a way that would help his party very much, especially on Japan issues. He's just really rammed forward and has not tried to prepare his party for certain things either. And he just kind of like let the party flail in that sense. And I do think that the noise around some of his moves, some of his most controversial moves, like Japan, might get louder in the National Assembly. It might become a bigger headache for the PPP in the National Assembly as a result of that. But if President Yoon takes steps to sort of like bring his party along or try to talk to them to, explain like how to really frame these issues within the assembly, that could really matter, because we saw that during the Fukushima water release, the DP was doing all it could to really rile up the public, but the president did everything he could to really tamp it down, and the party followed his example. And if there's more coordination in that sense, you could sort of see him still pursuing, controversial things on Japan, but still not really keep the anger boiling over in the National Assembly. I don't think that it's going to affect his general approach on foreign policy much, because he doesn't need the National Assembly to make these foreign policy decisions. And I have been wondering if actually this might make him double down on some of his foreign policy ambitions, because it might become the only legacy that he could leave behind. And he feels so strongly about the US Korea alliance, and that maybe he'll just really double down on it. He might really double down on his strong, stance on North Korea, because that might end up being his legacy. This might end up being his only legacy, the foreign policy part. DP is unhappy with Yoon's China policy, but if Yoon ends up reconsidering his China policy, then he's going to have to reconsider US-ROK alliance issues too. So it starts to touch what I think is a fundamental goal of President Yoon personally, which is to make a mark on US-ROK alliance matters. And that matters to him so much personally that I don't think he's going to bend. And I don't think that the election results are going to matter in that sense.
So I think Troy and Michelle did a really thorough job of this. So I don't have much to add other than two things. Number one, we have to understand that the opposition campaigned on a platform that was about making bringing a judgment on the Yoon administration. I think the Rebuilding Party or the Innovation Party, depending on who you ask, they have different names for it. They even openly talked about investigations and impeachment. So there's definitely obstruction, but it could be more than that. So for President Yoon, the question here is, I think, and Michelle raised that issue very well, how is he going to manage his relationship with the opposition now? I don't think at any time during the last 2 years he's had a sit-down meeting with the leader of the Progressive Party. I think it's about time now he needs to do that. But if he doesn't, and he decides to double down on this sort of unilateral approach, then it could become a very contentious 3 years, filled with motions to investigate, to potentially obstruct different members of the administration. The second thing here is that the opposition, as Michelle pointed out, on the Japan issue, has voiced an opinion on foreign policy issues. And they've always opposed the president, not only on Japan, but also on China, also on the United States, also on Russia. So on all of these areas, there's going to be more scrutiny. There's going to be more legislative oversight. And the question here is, how does that play into President Yoon's relationship with his counterparts in other countries as he negotiates, other items on the agenda about what he can bring to the table, what he can deliver. This is a credibility issue, and also, the other side is going to think, is this something we want to negotiate with this administration about if this administration can't deliver on its promises? Finally, the last issue, I think Troy did a really good job. And Troy made me think about a parallel And I think the Clinton administration works. But for me, also, the W. Bush first term works. And he came in very, just barely and won that election. But he came in with the Congress that was going to keep him in check. Well, what changed the whole atmosphere? A crisis. And so anything can happen between now and the next 3 years. We're seeing some, monumental stuff happening in Ukraine. We're seeing something unfold right now in the Middle East. There's no reason why something can't explode in this part of the world, right? And the question and obviously the response is going to. I don't think the response is going to be impeach the president, but it may be rallying around the flag kind of effect. And maybe President Yoon could have, an opportunity there on his hands. But again, we don't know. So that's a big unknown. But what I'll say is, I think, Troy and Michelle is definitely right that this is, it's going to be a difficult challenging 3 years for the president unless he figures out a way to move forward in a constructive way with the opposition.
Thank you, James. Michelle and James brought up really interesting points about, Michelle mentioned first that Yoon could actually double down on foreign policy matters that really matter to him, such as a strengthening of the US-ROK alliance, cooperation with Japan. And then James, you said that with the election outcome being what it is, that there is going to be much more scrutiny on Yoon's foreign policy, more legislative oversight. So Troy, I want to come back to you and see if you had any thoughts or come back to these points.
Yeah, no, I think, James is right about this. When we look at the foreign policy side, if you're going to take and see shifts in foreign policy from Yoon, a lot of this might come from pressure through investigations, different oversight policies in the National Assembly itself, because when you have that tool to put scrutiny on it, you can take and start raising questions. And that might lead, we might not see massive shifts, but it could lead to subtle changes to try and address political concerns. And also, this whole point that, James again raised about, so if you're a foreign partner, you've worked with Yoon now for 2 years, you've seen him get some things done, but there was always the prospect you could do more if the conservatives were able to take back the National Assembly. Now that's not on the table, and that this is likely going to be something to where these policies are going to be scrutinized more. That might lead to some reluctance for partners as well. So I think, this is where you see it, not in Yoon's ability to actually do these things in a general sense, but in just the broader political dynamics at play domestically, and then how that impacts how far maybe Yoon is willing to go on some things, knowing that he might face more severe backlash, and also, how much, sensitivity his partners have. And, on James', question about, or comment as well on, the potential for a crisis to change things, given what we're seeing in the world right now, that's something to take in. But I also think this is a reason why Yoon and the DP need to take and have a deeper conversation about foreign policy. It's one thing to have like differences, but we're living in a much more dangerous world. And it seems to be that there is a greater distance developing between the two sides on foreign policy approaches. And so, what that means in a crisis and like how that plays out, I think is going to be important. And so finding some common ground, I think, is going to be critical on the foreign policy side, not just to help Yoon move his agenda forward, but that if you do have a crisis, if you have your opposition going against you, that makes it harder to maybe do the things that might need to be done during that crisis. And so I think, James pointed out, there's differences on Ukraine, there's differences on China, there's differences on Japan. Some of these are probably very deeply held in the case of Japan. The ones on Russia are maybe shallower, but, I think there needs to be a lot of work done in this area.
But as you point out, Troy, last 2 years, things haven't really changed even after this election. And the way that the administration had moved forward, it's exactly what Michelle kind of the picture that she's painted. So I don't have huge conviction that this
Oh,
is
yeah.
how it's going to go. But
No, I agree. I'm just more concerned about your crisis comment and everything than, the broader, like, if no crisis happens in the region, I think you can kind of continue with the status quo. But if a crisis hits, there needs to be some kind of understanding, domestically on like, this is our approach and how we do it, because steep political divisions in a foreign policy crisis could be, challenging to deal with.
Thanks for your comments. I do want to talk a little bit about inter-Korean relations in the light of this election. Now, in recent history, all past administrations in South Korea have used inter-Korean relations, the North Korea card in one way or the other, including the conservative administrations. Do you think there is any possibility, just throwing this out there, I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious about what you think. Do you think there's any possibility that the Yoon administration might use engagement with North Korea in the light of its defensive position, right? Coming out of this election with this huge defeat? Or do you think that he will double down on North Korea, to borrow Michelle's expression? What do you think?
I think you should answer that.
Huh?
Yeah,
What?
Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah.
You're the expert on this.
I personally, I think that he will double down, especially given North Korea's policy on South Korea. We have seen over the past few months North Korea's position on South Korea, disestablishing all organizations that have dealt with inter-Korean affairs. Basically, Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to leave a lot of room right now for any kind of inter-Korean engagement to happen. That is not to say that engagement will never happen in the future, but in the next 3 years, looking at it from Kim Jong-un's point of view, especially in the light of this election outcome and basically the referendum on Yoon and how the public feels about the Yoon administration, I don't see why Kim Jong-un should give any kind of space for the Yoon administration. That's my own thinking on the subject.
We're all like, okay, let's talk.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, no, just a quick thing that, yeah, I agree with you. And not to jump questions, but I think the real test to Yoon's North Korea policy is going to be if Trump comes into office. And if Trump tries to engage with Kim and puts Yoon in the middle of that, that's actually going to put him in a tough position, and reconsider how his North Korea policy has been, how to actually manage the US in this situation, whether to engage North Korea. So I think the actual test of it is going to come if Trump gets elected.
So the one thing I would say, I agree in principle, but there's something about Kim Jong-un's recent moves that makes me think he's a political opportunist. The whole relationship with Russia, was a great moment of political opportunity for him, which he's embraced. You've had this dance, which seems to be dying off, between Japan and North Korea, which, to be honest, was one of political opportunity. If Yoon put out feelers and everything, I wonder if Kim Jong-un might see it as a moment of political opportunity to extract maximum concessions. And so, I'm not saying that Yoon will reach out, but I think while on the surface, I agree that there's very little reason for Kim Jong-un to do this. He's got a great thing going with Russia. This could take and maybe complicate that. But, if he found a way, I could see maybe Kim trying to take advantage of that opportunity, just given what we've kind of seen in terms of his, we'll call it post-pandemic maneuvers. That being said, Lee Myung-bak had a fairly hardline North Korea policy, and he tried to arrange a summit, we knew towards the end. So I think there's always the possibility Yoon might try to, reach out to the North Koreans. But it's a very interesting dynamic, one, for the reasons you raise, two, given how North Korea, I think, is changing in terms of how it's sort of handling some of these engagements. And also, as Michelle talked about, how Trump might change this if he were to win.
James, did you have anything to add before we move on to the
I think it would be a masterstroke political move on the administration's part to to try to transition from the current policy. and it may end up being a common ground with the progressives where multiple different kinds of possibilities open up. But I question whether that's likely. I mean, the other side, it's one thing for Yoon to want to dance, but does Kim Jong-un want to dance with Yoon?
And
He
it
seems
takes
to be
two to
doing
tango for sure.
fairly well with Putin right now, and who knows Troy mentioned this picture, Kim with Yoon and Trump. What about if we put Putin in there? Man, that's like it's just really interesting imagery from the optics point of view.
Mm. Michelle mentioned Trump, and I'm glad she did because or the next U.S. President, because that is something that I did want to get to. So Yoon's last 2 years in office will overlap with either Biden's second term or a Trump presidency. So how might the U.S. presidential election outcome affect Yoon's foreign policy or US-ROK relations more specifically, or even inter-Korean relations? Michelle kind of touched on that already, but Michelle, if you had anything to add, or James or Troy,
I mean,
this is for all of you.
I'm glad to jump in here. So, I think there's obviously there's two options. If Biden wins re-election, I think you see a continuation of what we have largely seen, to where there's deeper cooperation on economic security issues. You try to align more in terms of dealing with things like a Taiwan contingency, dealing with, this gets into the economic security side, like semiconductor development within China itself and China's access to that and its ability to develop AI. You see a lot of these sort of high-tech issues remain at the forefront of the agenda. If you see Trump win, well, then you start to see changes. One, there will be more focus on burden sharing and whether Korea is paying enough. Two, you will start seeing, depending on which direction Trump takes on China, perhaps more pressure than you would see under Biden administration on Samsung, SK Hynix, and other companies and their operations in China, and perhaps the comfort of the administration with that. You would see, more mixed, confusing signals in terms of like how the United States views the relationship, and that would mean that a lot of Yoon's time would be spent not perhaps in building out things that, while there have been complaints in Korea about the CHIPS Act and the IRA, that ultimately take and provide benefits to South Korea as well, to trying to take and prevent basically South Korea's position in some of these industries from eroding based on Trump's policies. For example, you would likely see a Trump administration, because they probably wouldn't be able to appeal the Inflation Reduction Act, but changing the regulations to make sure that essentially the benefits are undermined or eliminated. And so there's some ways you can do that in the regulatory process. And so I think you'd see a Yoon administration that's, rather than trying to take and really expand the relationship, having to focus on how do you take and just really prevent the degradation of your position in some of these industries. And so the focus becomes much more complicated. And so in a lot of ways, the economic side plays a big role with the burden sharing and the questions about the future of the alliance itself becoming paramount, to where you don't necessarily have that with a Biden administration.
Michelle, James, did you have anything to add?
I was gonna say exactly what Troy said. So, one thing I will add is that I've wondered a lot about the personality dynamic between Yoon and Trump, and how that might pan out, and how that might be a bit of a wild card that we can't predict. Because the personality, I mean, Moon Jae-in's personality was so different, and Yoon has a very, he is, again, the buck stops here guy, and I think Trump might appreciate that to a certain extent. And there's a lot to be said about what you can do in that like personal diplomacy space. I think we saw that with like Shinzo Abe really greasing the wheels with Trump and trying to smooth that relationship from the beginning. And I'm very interested to see if Trump is reelected, how that might pan out, because if the two leaders are able to develop some sort of an interesting personality dynamic, then it could smooth out some of these issues that we're already anticipating. I mean, I do expect SMA to be an issue. We're already seeing US and ROK officials renegotiate it, trying to fend off any sort of changes beyond November. But I'm going to be very curious to see how the personality dynamic plays out if that becomes the case.
James? Any thoughts?
I actually think, I actually think I'm in agreement with whatever Troy and Michelle already said. I think they laid everything out. I actually think that the election could be that one of those triggers that could potentially get the president to act with the progressives and the same on the other side. So because Trump 2.0. It's there are a lot of uncertainties about what that would mean for the region. So when uncertainties are high, that's when you're most anxious, and that could also bring about this kind of a crisis, kind of a moment, or it could be an opportunity, as I suggested earlier. So I wouldn't know. We're too early. I mean, it's way too early to say for sure, but I think Troy covered all the grounds there with Biden potential outcome, and also with Trump outcome, what that would mean.
I'm going to throw out something that's a little bit controversial. So we saw Yoon talking about or referring to the potential of South Korea acquiring nuclear latency in January 2023. If Trump is elected in November of this year, do you think that will come back to the fore, that the nuclear debate? And especially if Michelle is right about Yoon possibly trying to double down on his main foreign policy agenda items, given the defeat in the election.
I'll just jump in here and just say this, okay? Two things. Number one, US-ROK alliance has largely been the foundation of deterrence in Korean Peninsula since the armistice signing, and we haven't had a second Korean War. So we've got quite a bit of data there that says that deterrence works to some extent, though people disagree on what that is, what deterrence is exactly. I would say another war on the peninsula. We didn't have that. So to that extent, it seemed to have done its job. So the question here is, why do we need it? And if Korea, the only reason why Korea would need it if the alliance isn't there, right? So the question then is, what is the future of the alliance in Trump 2.0? And I think the answer to the question of nuclear latency or nuclear development would depend largely on the answer to that other question, is what happens to the alliance? And I think a lot of allies are asking the same question. It's not just South Korea. I think NATO's asking the same question, and Japan's asking, and so Korea's not alone here. Maybe Korea should be asking with these other players to get to an answer that's workable for everyone. But it seems to be the case that would be the key driver here in answering that question.
Yeah, I agree with James on this, and we could actually, maybe if Trump wins, have a really interesting conversation on what foreign policy looks like, because you're right, South Korea has to look to other potential partners if Trump were to go that direction. The one caveat I would add to all of this, and this I think is also where James' point about like talking to other partners matters, when this question of South Korea potentially going nuclear comes up, it's often put in a bilateral context of like, well, if the US would agree to this for one reason, then this can happen. That I think is a very shallow reading of how this would play out. If you look at what you need to develop a nuclear weapons program and then to sustain it, there's lots of things that would have to come from other countries that might not be as amenable. And I've talked with people from some of those governments, and basically their response was they would not accept a nuclear South Korea. Now, perhaps if the alliance ended, those views would shift. But I think, this isn't simply about, okay, as long as if Trump says I'm into the alliance, but you have a nuclear weapon, we're all good. Like, it's not going to be that simplistic. So I think this is a much more complicated issue as well.
Michelle, would you like to add anything here?
Okay.
All right, so we have 7 questions from the audience. I think most of them have been covered, but I do want to come to these 2 questions. The first is regarding the North Korean human rights issue. In light of the election results, how do you see the issue being affected going forward in South Korea? Does anybody want to answer this question?
I mean, so Yoon has tried to move this issue to the forward. They released their first North Korea human rights report. So I would assume that this would be something that, unless the Yoon administration decided to radically shift his North Korea policy, like we've talked about potentially earlier, that you would continue to see a focus on this in the administration, regardless of the outcome.
Another question is, what do you make of Tae Young-ho's defeat? What might have caused it, and what does it tell you about the future role of North Korean defectors in South Korean politics?
Well, Tae Young didn't get the easy district this time. Somebody else got it. And so the party leaders put him in a more difficult, challenging district. So the chances of him getting elected there was fairly low to begin with. And that, in order to answer that question, why did that happen? You got to understand the internal party dynamics of pro-Yoon versus anti-Yoon, or pro-Han versus anti-Han. Who cares? I mean, who knows what determined that? But it seems to be the case that it's clear that Tae wasn't in the crowd with the leadership in the current conservative party. So that's probably the reason why he got pushed out of a more, easy district to a more difficult district.
Well, he also had the ethics investigations into him and was mired in a couple different scandals. And after that happened, he definitely got pushed down in the party, favored list. And he was shifted over to Kuro, and the chances weren't going to be great. And now Chizong will also step down because he didn't make the Piredapio list. But there is one new defector who was elected, or he was a proportional seat representative, Park Chung-gon. I interviewed him about a week ago. He is he's he used to be at the Kim Il-sung, like the National Defense University. He was a ballistic missile researcher for the regime, very elite. He defected in 2009. He's 38. He is a very young generation he's the Cheongbodong generation of defectors, and he really made it into a high-profile job in South Korea. He got a PhD at Seoul National University and then joined Hyundai Steel as a senior researcher. So he comes from a very prestigious background, and PPP chose him as #2 proportional representation candidate. So they really wanted him. They recruited him. He's clearly not representative of North Korean defectors overall, in that most North Korean defectors have not graduated high school, or they've graduated, or they've only attained high school education, and most North Korean defectors are women. And also, it's not representative of South Korean young people either, because the path that Park Chung-gon took is very elite and very elusive. But he's a really interesting dynamic in that because he came here to South Korea in 2009, he spent a lot of his late 20s and into his 30s in South Korea. He feels very much like this North Korean born South Korean and dual identity, that he doesn't want to be boxed in as a North Korean. He doesn't only want to work on inter-Korean relations. He wants to really work on like South Korea industrial policy as well because of his background. So I think he'll bring definitely a different kind of dynamic to the National Assembly. He will unfortunately be just one voice out of 300 that represents defector perspective in the way that he wants to. But I do hope that his candidacy will inspire some other people to hopefully make the run as well.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I recall hearing about this with Mr. Park or Dr. Park, and this was a very good reminder, and I should read your article as well. Thank you. So I think we have it's now 10:30 Eastern time. Just very quickly, maybe just one issue that if you have for the audience to maybe to be on the lookout for in terms of foreign policy before we wrap up. Maybe just one item from each of you. What should we look out for? The top foreign policy agenda going forward.
Well, I'll throw something out. You know, when Park Jin left as foreign minister, we saw a subtle shift in emphasis and discussion about needing to balance more with China. And so sort of seeing how that shift takes place in terms of balancing relations with the United States and Japan as opposed to China, I think is one thing to watch more going forward.
Thank you. Michelle?
I would watch when the next ROK Japan summit would take place. It's been a while since the last one, and relations have slightly stalled since then, and it seems to be a time for a renewed meeting. And I would also be watching the ROK Japan-China potential trilateral happening. There's some talk of that. Korea's been trying to push that forward. So I'll be interested to see if that happens and when and how.
James?
Even though 2027's, eons away from Korean politics timeline, I would look and see if who emerges here as a potential presidential runner in the next cycle. What next after Yoon, after 3 years, if you really want to get ahead of the curve. And the key question here is what happens to Mr. Han Dong-un? Does he remain in politics, or does he disappear? And then the question is what happens to the leadership of the Conservative Party? So I'd watch that, and obviously the implications we talked about already, where the Conservatives stand on a lot of foreign policy issues.
Okay, so thank you to all of our three panelists, James, Michelle, and Troy. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion, and to all of our viewers, and we will wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thanks.